Selsey. You've just seen two flying objects. The first is a film of a UFO, unidentified flying object, flying saucer, call it what you like. And that caused a great deal of excitement when it was shown on television, nearly a year ago now. And even today, we are not absolutely certain what the object was, even though plenty of people, including myself, have got their own ideas about it. Now, the second flying object was a great deal easier to identify. In fact, we have here two flying objects, one Frisbee and one Peruvian. Welcome, Michael.
Hello, Pat.
Now, look, if we're going to take a long, hard look at the entire UFO problem, I think it's only fair to nail our colours to the mast straight away. And I record myself as being the most complete skeptic about the idea that flying saucers are spaceships coming from other worlds. I don't believe a word of it, and I'm quite sure that all the sightings can be explained much more easily than that. But I don't think you quite agree.
Well, I'm a hopeful agnostic. I sincerely hope that one day we will meet an alien, but so far I've only met about 2% of the sightings, which really are totally inexplicable as far as I'm concerned. And I'm also fascinated by the aerodynamic shapes of the UFOs themselves. I mean, look at this Frisbee, and look at the way it flies back. It's quite extraordinary. Look at that.
Caught it. Well, Michael, we used a Frisbee, obviously, because it is aerodynamically shaped. And when these things were first reported, they were always known as flying saucers. I'm not quite sure when they changed over to UFO, but a flying saucer it could be. But people who have reported them say there are other shapes as well, don't they?
Yes, indeed. We've got the famous Havana shape from Cuba, the cigar up there, which launches the little saucers, apparently. And then you've got the dumbbell shape. Now, I like that one because you've got the nuclear power plant here, and that sends the ion beam straight up the accelerator tube, separated from the crew's quarters, who are then shielded from the nuclear power plant, and that generates an electromagnetic field. Out goes the ion beam, and by reaction, the deep space ship then moves off.
Then, of course, you have the famous lampshade model.
Worn on the head, it looks very, very attractive.
So there are various shapes, by no means all of them aerodynamic, ranging, as you say, from the cigars to the lampshades to the dumbbells. But I think we've got to remember, haven't we, Michael, that there are various natural objects which are also aerodynamically shaped. Look at these pectites, most mysterious things. They're small, they're glassy, found only in certain restricted areas of the Earth. These two come from Australia. They seem to have been heated at least once and probably twice. And what are they? Do they come from space or don't they?
I don't know. They look very like obsidian, don't they? Volcanic glass. Could they have been thrown up by a volcano, chucked out about 300,000 feet, then come back in the atmosphere and got heat on the way up and heat on the way in?
I suppose that was one theory. It doesn't seem to ring very true. I think no one really knows what they are. But they do exist, undoubtedly, and there we have an example of something that may have come from space and certainly isn't a flying saucer. I'd very much like to know what pectites are.
So would I.
You know, these ideas about flying saucers aren't new, are they? What about the Bible? Remember the fiery wheel of Ezekiel?
There's a man in America who worked for NASA who wrote a very interesting book called The Spaceships of Ezekiel.
Yes.
And he did machine drawings of them. And he thought they sounded like some form of atmosphere vessel, i.e. it had helicopter blades in it. And I asked Professor Eric Blaithwaite what he thought, and he said, of course, what do wheels within wheels suggest to you, Michael? And I said, what about gyroscopes? Because that's his speciality.
Well, I find it very difficult to believe that the fiery wheel of Ezekiel was a gyroscope. And because there's old woodcuts, much later than Ezekiel.
These were, what, 16th century?
1561, the Nuremberg broadsheet.
Well, there you are. Now, that's, they definitely are flying saucers of some sort, or some sort of flying object.
Now, the stories go back a long way, but the term flying saucer doesn't. That, I think, goes back to 1947. Remember, Kenneth Arnold, who was an American businessman flying over the Rockies in his own private aircraft, and saw a chain of what he described as pie pan-like objects, and then somebody turned it into a flying saucer, and flying saucers they've remained. I believe the entire flying saucer story might have died down if it hadn't been for that tragedy at Fort Knox in 1948. When Captain Mantell, in a fighter, chased one of these things up to about 20,000 feet and blacked out and was killed.
Now, that's interesting because he's on ordinary oxygen. He's not in a pressurized airplane, and it's a piston-engined airplane. Supposing we take anoxia, oxygen starvation,
yes,
or even carbon monoxide poisoning, it would cause euphoria, he would start to hallucinate, and then, of course, he would become unconscious, black out, and go straight into the deck.
Well, that apparently is what happened. And during the war, you were debriefing pilots, and I gather you had quite a lot of flying saucer reports.
Well, no, that was in the winter of 43-44. We were doing specialized raids on Stettin, that part of the Baltic, and some pilots coming back from a raid, they were flying Lancasters, so that's about 24,000 feet for the raid. They'd seen lights in the sky. Now, we thought They were airborne lights by German fighters. Now, they were in the area where there was the new research station at Peenemünde, so it could have been a special weapon. So they'd fired at these lights with their mid-upper turrets and rear turrets, and they'd had no result. They hadn't shot the light out. All that they'd got was a light which was flying around and around the aeroplane.
Well, same kind of thing with the Foo Fighters that I heard so much about during the war. These are daytime things, again, lights seen around an aircraft, and at one stage suspected of being due to enemy action. But I think there's one way in which we can show that the Foo Fighters were definitely not spacecraft, because since the end of the war, they have disappeared completely, and no one's ever seen them again.
Now, that's fascinating, because air combat nowadays takes place at around about 50,000 feet, 49,000, 50,000, 60,000 feet. That's 20,000 feet higher in pressurized aircraft, with the pilots wearing pressurized suits. They don't hallucinate because they've got a much better environment to carry out the combat maneuver in.
So whatever they were certainly not flying saucers. Now let's turn to something else, Michael, something you know so much more about than I do.
Oh.
Yes, well, look at this.
I don't know about that.
These extraordinary things on the plain of Nazca in Peru.
Oh, yeah.
These straight lines, and some people have even suggested that those were tracks for flying saucer landing grounds.
Oh, I don't think they're that for a moment. This is actually the Pan American Highway, which cuts right through it. I've flown over this a number of times. I've orbited it, and they are definitely some form of Earth zodiac. If you talk to Dr. Reich, Maria Reich, she says, and she spent 25 years examining them, that they are deeply religious, they have a ritual significance, and they have some form of alignment. Perhaps they are, in fact, alignments for the equinox and the solstice.
Well, that picture was taken in the air, of course, but can they be seen except from the air? What about mountains or something like that?
Well, yes, you could, because the mountains aren't very far away. They're not very high, but they're 3,000-4,000 feet high.
Whatever they are, you'll agree they're certainly not flying saucer tracks.
No, certainly not.
Have you ever seen a flying saucer?
I don't know, Pat. I saw something very odd in 1958, and that would have been at ABC television. I was looking out of the window about 11 o'clock in the morning, just been having coffee and a bit of a break, and I was watching a Britannia aircraft coming in on the final approach to London Airport. So it was somewhere over Richmond, and it had just put its wheels down, just put its flaps down, so it was doing about 140 knots. Behind it was a light. Now I thought, well, I looked at the cloud, and I thought it was about 5/10 cloud, half the sky obscured by cloud. I thought, this is the reflection of the aircraft on the cloud. 11 o'clock in the morning, remember, around about September. Not too high a sun. Suddenly, the light accelerated and passed the aircraft, and then it suddenly went straight up in the air and shot up to the zenith to speed I would have estimated 400 or 500 miles an hour.
Any idea what it was?
Not the slightest.
Have you come across anything else you can't explain in the same way?
There was one thing that did happen, which was told me by Captain Kling and Captain Sanviti. There were two 10,000-hour men. Well, you know, that means 20 years flying. They've seen everything. And on two separate nights, over the plain of Nazca, flying at about 8,000 feet, absolutely clear weather, no cloud over the plain of Nazca, they both saw UFOs. They saw it, their crew saw it, the stewardesses saw it, and the passengers. They were flying DC-6Bs, and I suppose they had about 30, 40 passengers aboard, and during that time, their radios were cut clean out until the UFO disappeared. But of course, both Lima range and Arequipa range at either end thought they'd crashed.
What did they look like?
It was a pulsating light which approached the airplane, and then it flew around it, and then it flew alongside it, and then it went straight up to the zenith, rather like the one that I saw at Teddington.
And again, equally unexplained.
Totally.
Because there have been one or two flying saucer stories that have made headlines and have now been explained. I remember one that made the headlines in the BBC News not so very long ago, and that was the famous New Zealand flying saucer. Yeah. And that caused a lot of interest. You can see these small flickering lights there. Now, this film was taken from an aircraft, and probably those lights are dancing around because of the aircraft's own motion. And then you get the actual object itself, a blob with markings across it, looking superficially a bit like the planet Jupiter. But I don't think, you know, that anyone now doubts that it really was a planet, but it was the planet Venus.
I've seen film which was fascinating of a lake up in the Rockies, in that recreation area, somewhere near Lake Tahoe. And it was taken on Super 8. I've seen it within the last year. It was transmitted in America. And then I examined the 16mm blow-up of it. It isn't a fake. It's a light with flames bleeding off it, which passes right across the screen, over a lake, behind some trees, and in the foreground you can see people getting up and watching it. And I have no explanation at all, unless it's something from a decaying orbit.
You know, Michael, I get a tremendous number of flying saucer reports, and most of them, frankly, you can dismiss out of hand. But now and then you come across something more interesting, and I had one of those the other day. And this came from a 15-year-old whom I didn't know, who lived not very far away from me, and was coming home from school and saw something very interesting indeed, and obviously didn't know what it was and was decidedly scared. Well, he rang me. I wasn't there, my answer phone was on, so I got the conversation recorded, and this is what he said.
Hello. Well, it was a very, very big object, and it had squares on it, which were very bright white lights, and they flashed when I first saw it, and it was over an oak tree when I first saw it, and then it disappeared, and then it appeared again over another oak tree, and it was, you know, very, very big, and the lights flashed in a sequence very, very quickly, and it did it 3 times, and then it just disappeared, and that was it.
Well, I was interested in that, so I went down to see him. I had a long talk with him, and there's no doubt in my mind he was telling the truth. He wasn't making it up. And he came up with some very interesting facts. For example, the lights were flashing in sequence, and then previously he'd seen a kind of dark dome-shaped object over him. Well, what do you make of that, Michael?
Well, it sounds rather like the Kling and San Viti sighting in Peru. They saw this flashing light. It changed its colours, and there was this dim shape shown underneath the light. I think that could be it.
Well, I don't know what it was. I don't for one moment think it was a spaceship, but it was something very interesting, and it was one of those reports I thought was worth following up, although I've not been able to have it confirmed. But I suppose the various flying saucer societies get dozens of these reports every day.
Well, there are thousands of societies now all over the world, aren't there? There's some completely reputable people involved. It isn't a disreputable activity at all.
Well, I think we agree there's a tremendous amount of nonsense talked about this whole subject. On the other hand, it is taken very seriously by a great number of extremely sincere people. And I was fascinated earlier on, in the 18th of January, 1979, there was actually a debate initiated in the House of Lords. And this was started by Lord Clancarty, who of course is a firm believer in UFOs, and even thinks that they probably come not from the sky, but from inside the Earth, and pop out through a hole in the North Pole. But coming down to brass tacks, if we reject the spaceship idea, and personally I do, then what can UFOs be? Well, satellite debris to start with. Remember Skylab that came a little while ago? Look at those pictures, the Skylab descending.
Well, that's extraordinary, that one, because you can see the trail. And of course he did make a dent in Western Australia.
Well, he did. The whole point being, of course, it wasn't expected to come down until a few days previously, and if anyone living in Australia suddenly seeing a piece of descending Skylab simply wouldn't have known what it was if they hadn't been alerted. And then the blast in 1908 in Siberia. Well, it blew pine trees flat for many miles in all directions. Look at that picture of debris. And I've been going into this quite deeply. Could have been a meteorite, but I think it's much more likely to have been the nucleus of a small comet, which of course would have evaporated on impact. But the flying saucer believers have been very vocal about this and have talked about nuclear spacecraft, etc.
Well, I think that if there'd been a nuclear blast, there wouldn't be a tree left, it'd just be ash. But the trees in the photographs, you can see, have been laid out there in a almost completely irregular pattern. The one or two still standing up. That looks much more like the Somme in 1917. If that was a nuclear blast, not a thing left.
Yes, that was undoubtedly either a comet, nucleus, or a meteorite. Of course, meteorites do fall quite often. That's a piece of meteorite, and I'm sure that meteorites have been responsible for a great many flying saucer reports. That would have made quite a dent if it had hit anybody, and of course that was only part of a larger body.
Where actually was that?
Well, that was part of the Barwell meteorite that landed in 1965. We've shown it on television quite often before, and there you see the blackened part, which is the part of the outer casing.
And that stone, it's
immensely heavy. Yes, but it was seen as it flashed across England. Many people did see it. I didn't. It was cloudy where I was.
Oh.
But there's the holder of the heavyweight record. That's the Hobart West meteorite. Weighs over 60 tons, and just imagine the kind of dent that would have made.
Good grief. How deep would the crater be?
Well, there wasn't a crater there. It simply merely landed, but of course it's prehistoric. It must have been there for a great many thousands of years.
And of course it would have eroded round it, I think.
Well, I've no doubt at all that meteors and meteorites do account for a great many flying saucer sightings, and they can be explained. There's something else that does intrigue me very much, and it's just become respectable. Ball lightning. Now, there is a picture of ball lightning. It was taken some time ago, in 1930.
It is an odd thing, isn't it? My father saw ball lightning. My mother saw ball lightning on another occasion. I believe I saw it in the Andes once. You get that sort of phenomena up there, because it's a very, very dry, dusty sort of atmosphere. And, of course, up to 7 years ago, you would have been called a raving lunatic. Now, of course, it's accepted.
It's very strange indeed, and I'm sure we get some sort of reports from there. And actually, while we were driving down to make this program, we saw one of these curious ice clouds. And look at them, that remarkably sort of light.
Yes, well, of course, this is a lenticular cloud, isn't it?
Yes.
You sometimes see these in this era. You get an extraordinary, get a whole flight of them coming in. And with the westering sun, or the very early morning light, you do get the aberration, you get that flickering on it. It looks exactly like a fleet of saucers flying in towards you.
Tell you something else I saw once, too. I was observing at night in my dome with my 15-inch telescope. It was half moon. I was observing the moon. And suddenly I saw some very curious lights flashing about, dancing. And these really puzzled me. And they could have been flying saucers quite easily. And eventually I found out what they were.
What was it?
It was pollen. In the moonlight, only a few feet above my observatory. And they really did give a remarkably saucer-like appearance. And I've heard people being taken in by swarms of insects, too.
Yes, I've seen swarms of insects flying below me, funnily enough. I also once flew a glider through a huge cloud of aphids. And right along the leading edge of the wing we had aphids. And they looked exactly like a reflection of a saucer.
There's one point, I think, we ought to bring out here, and you know more about this than I do. What about radar reflections of UFOs? We hear so much about these.
I know a little bit about airborne radar. We did have a lot of ghosts in the early days. Then later, when they went down to the centimetric range and then into the millimetric range, they were able to eliminate the ghosting pretty well. And once you've actually calibrated the radar, of course, you can reduce it. But what you do get with the modern solid-state radar is you can even pick up migrating birds. And there were some wonderful pictures taken of migrating birds crossing the Straits of Gibraltar from the radar sets on the top of the Rock of Gibraltar. Incredible pictures.
Well, what do you make of the actual radar reflections from so-called UFOs?
I think they could also be flocks of migrating birds. They could also be lenticular clouds, I suppose, once again. What about convection?
Well, you might get a radar reflection from inversion, and in strange weather conditions high up in the atmosphere, where the temperature goes up for a bit instead of going down. But my whole point here is that if you get a radar reflection, it need not necessarily come from a solid object.
No, absolutely, absolutely. You can get it from storm clouds, for instance, cumulus nimbus. They've got these warning devices on most aircraft nowadays. You just fly around the storm.
And of course, the best way of studying meteors now is by means of radar, because meteor trails give radar reflection, and that's really how George L. Banks started. So all that number of years ago.
That's extraordinary. Because how large would that actual particle be?
Oh, the actual particle of a meteor can be smaller than a grain of sand, but of course it causes a trail in the atmosphere,
yes,
and it's that gives a radar reflection. We've left almost to the last one class of object that I believe is responsible for more flying saucer reports than any other, and that, Michael, is the humble weather balloon. Okay. And I remember again an experience of my own with my 12.5-inch reflector this time, back at East Grinstead, my own home, many years ago, and again I was observing the moon, and suddenly, against the Mare Crisium, one of the dark plains, yes, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Well, I know that area pretty well, and I watched it, and it moved toward the edge of the moon very slowly, and then cleared the limb and started to glow red, and I thought, really, the Martians have come at last. So I clapped on the highest power eyepiece I'd got, and I saw it, and of course it was a weather balloon. It's remarkably like a flying saucer. Have you come across that kind of thing?
I've only seen one, and that was well above me. Again, I was in a small aeroplane, and I suppose that must have been about something like 100,000 feet.
So weather balloons, I'm sure, are responsible for a great many flying saucer reports. But then, aircraft reflections. Do you remember a film some years ago taken from an aircraft which showed the flying saucer very clearly indeed? And it was a long time before anyone realized what it was, and an experiment had to be made to prove that it was, in fact, a complicated window deflection. And there was a film of it. A passenger was filming through the aircraft window when a cigar-shaped object came into view. When the film was examined frame by frame, it seemed as though the object were moving at around 5,000 mph. Later, a camera team set out to duplicate the effect, and the object turned out to be the tip of the tailplane reflected in the edge of the aircraft window. What about this question of aircraft reheating? Again, you know so much more than I do.
Well, all I know is that reheat came in as a tremendous boost, like an overdrive on a car gearbox, and there is an enormous thrust, but of course there's an enormous flare from it. And if you saw an aircraft, obviously a fighter plane, and it'd be pretty high up, I should think, or on takeoff sometimes, they go into this tremendous surge of power. You do get a great flare moving at great speed, and that could easily be mistaken.
Until you know the size of an object, you can't tell how far away it is. And the same applies to two lights. Look at these. They appear very much the same, but in fact one is much brighter than the other, and I'll show you what I mean. This is a powerful light. And this one is simply a small pocket torch. But until you knew that one was further away from the other, there was no way in which you could tell. And let me give you another example. If you see dancing lights in the distance, can you tell how far away they are? The answer is you can't, unless you know what they are. In this case, car headlights coming down a hill less than a mile off. Even the moon, less than 250,000 miles away, has been mistaken for a flying saucer. Not obviously when it's high up as it is now, but when it's low down and rising through mist and cloud, and it's all distorted and you can't really see what it is. You know, Michael, way back in the early 1950s, I remember that there was something of a split in the ranks of the flying saucer believers. There were those who just saw unidentified flying objects and didn't know what they were, and those who claimed to have met beings from other worlds. And I'm thinking, of course, of George Adamski.
The man that wrote the book with Desmond Leslie.
That's right.
Yes, yes.
He said he met a Venusian in the Californian desert.
That's right.
And I remember interviewing him on BBC Panorama, you know, and I didn't know what to make of him at all. He was a delightful old chap, but, well, what do you think it could have been?
I think it was really a desire for Messiah, wasn't it? I mean, after all, there was an awful lot of trouble going on. We'd just come through a war. And if you look at the drawing of the Venusian, he's got very long hair. And it looks a little like Jesus without the beard. And it's very much the concept of Messiah. And I think probably some elderly gentleman would like to see Messiah coming, not as the old angelic force, but coming from right across space, because he was a very keen amateur astronomer, was he not?
Well, he certainly said he was, but whether in fact he made any observations, I don't know. Because there's something, a mass hallucination. Yeah. Do you remember 1938?
The War of the Worlds, Orson Welles, yes?
And they made that misleading broadcast over New York radio, and people actually believed that New York was being destroyed by invading Martians. And I've got the record, and it really is worth hearing.
Oh, wonderful.
What have you got?
I'm speaking from the roof of Broadcasting Building. I'm speaking from the roof of Broadcasting Building, New York City. The bells you hear are ringing to warn the people to evacuate the city as Martians approach. Estimated in the last 2 hours, 3 million people have moved out along the roads to the north.
Next day, it certainly made the headlines. You know, Michael, I wonder whether anything of the kind could happen now. I have a sort of feeling that it could.
I'm sure.
There were people who actually saw the Martians, felt the heat rays, and saw the fighting machines, and they genuinely believed it. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that people will believe anything. What about that famous divorce case? Is it true?
It's absolutely true, and I've met the chap concerned. He was an American, and he wrote a book a long time ago now called Aboard a Flying Saucer. And he described his adventures aboard a craft from the planet Venus, piloted by a beautiful lady whose name, I think, was Mrs. Aura Raines. Apparently he had a very good time indeed. His book came out as non-fiction, a true adventure, and his wife promptly sued him for divorce, cited the lady from Venus, and she won. The first interplanetary scandal in history.
It's absolutely fabulous.
Well, it was about the same time, you know, that I must admit to playing a hoax myself.
When
And this goes back to the early 1950s again. And I lived there not very far from East Grinstead in Sussex. I lived there for a long time. And in one of the local papers, I forget which it was now, I published an account of a flying saucer seen over Forest Row, which is a village not far from East Grinstead. And I said where it was and what it looked like and so on. And this came out in the local paper. And you know, Michael, over 20 people wrote in to confirm it.
Well, that's the living proof that people really see what they want to see.
Or Shades of the War of the Worlds. But, you know, just about the same time, a friend of mine, Alexander Helm, took a wonderful saucer photograph. And look at this slide. Isn't it magnificent?
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Isn't it splendid? Until you turn it upside down.
It's a puddle.
It is a puddle of water. And of course, the sky and the water appear to be interchanged. But the point there, surely, is that if you have that picture, and you don't know which way up it goes, and you look at it without knowing, it could quite easily pass as a really good saucer picture.
Oh, absolutely valid.
When you look around the solar system, Michael, the planets are not very prepossessing places. And I think we can say now, don't you, that there is no intelligent life in the solar system, except possibly on the Earth.
Not a chance. That means that they must come from deep space, from another constellation.
Well, if saucers were spaceships, which I don't believe for one moment, they must come from distances of millions of miles. And even going at the speed of light, they'd take years to do it.
Well, people are talking about some form of bionic machine that could actually project the intelligence in the form of a radio beam. I don't know whether that is in fact practical, but there are quite a number of rumours going about experiments and papers being read on it.
Meanwhile, I think we've got to admit, you know, that we do have unidentified flying objects. A lot of people take them very seriously, and although, I say again, I'm the most profound skeptic about the spacecraft theory, there's a lot we don't know.
Yes, I agree.
You know, science fiction has got an uncanny habit of turning into science fact, and things are happening now that would have been sheer science fiction only a few years ago.
Well, when you think, Pat, that 2%, that still there is 2% of sightings which nobody's really explained. That's what I'm interested in. That's why I'm still the hopeful agnostic.
Well, I wonder, if we ever do contact other beings, are they going to be like us, or are they going to be entirely different? They're going to be the same kind of material, undoubtedly, so they won't really be bug-eyed monsters. But will they look like us?
I don't see why they shouldn't be humanoid. I mean, obviously, if there are extreme conditions like the surface of Saturn or the surface of Jupiter or something like the giant planets, be squashed flat, you know, your ovoids, as you remember. But I don't see why they shouldn't resemble us. I really don't see why.
Well, Fred, what do you think of the planet Earth? To be frank, old man, not very much. Neither do I. Have you seen any sign of intelligent life? Not a flicker. In that case, let's go and have a look at the planet Saturn. Splendid idea!